Hi, everybody. Welcome to Lecture 1.2 of Mystery and Reason. So, we will introduce the mystery component of the course in this lecture by looking at the first short story that I'm having you read, The Body Farm by Geni. But before we get to that, we'll just talk a little bit about um, what's involved in fiction writing. We'll be doing nonfiction writing, analyzing nonfiction writing in our critical thinking part of the course, and we'll be trying to analyze these short stories, at least to some extent. We won't go into, s- you know, well, I'll try not to go into too much detail, but I also don't want to, go too quickly through them. I want to at least get into some of the subtleties and nuances and interesting aspects of the story that relate to our themes for the course, that relate to philosophical issues, maybe even current events, moral issues, and things like that. But let's start by just talking about what is often called the elements of fiction. You've probably seen some version of this in a maybe high school or even middle school English class. I think that's when I first was taught to read fiction in a way where you look for certain structural features of the short story or novel or whatever it may be. So, ooh, and I didn't want them all to show up at once. Let me fix that. Hold on. Up. Okay, here we go. So, I think it's safe to say that in nearly every work of fiction, whether it's a short story or a full-length novel, the following elements, I've got 11 of them. People will make similar lists of these things with more or less of them, but I've decided to go with the following 11 elements, which I think are present in one form or another in nearly every work of fiction. So, we've got, first of all, point of view. Who is narrating the story and what they know. So we distinguish between, most people are familiar with first person versus third person. So a first person point of view is when one of the characters is narrating it and they're using the first person pronoun I to talk about themselves. And so we can see their thoughts as well as what's happening around them, but we don't have an omniscient view, which is what we sometimes call the third person point of view or the omniscient point of view. Omniscient means all knowing. So a third person narrator is one that can just tell us anything about whatever's going on anywhere in the story, whatever's going on inside of any character's head. So those are the two most common points of view. And yeah, okay. So let me leave it at that. The setting, of course, is where and when the story takes place. Also, maybe the social context, the cultural context, historical context, and so on. The characters, this is pretty obvious. Those are the people that are involved in the story, their traits, and their development. The plot consists of, I think everybody knows this one, the actions and events which take place in the story. Exposition, this is often thought of as part of the plot, but I included it here as a separate category. Exposition is the background for the plot of the story. That's one way to think about it. So when we get filled in on things that have already happened before the main action of the story begins, when we get filled in on the setting, and the context for the events of the story, that's called give when the author is giving us exposition. Conflict. That is, of course, a tension or struggle between characters in the story. Climax is, again, part of the plot. It's the high point of the plot or the action in the story, and it's where the conflict is resolved or begins to be resolved. So I guess I could add some more things in here that I didn't add in, which are the idea of rising action. So as the plot develops, the action tends to rise, the conflict tends to get more intense until we reach the climax where the conflict is resolved. And then there's what's called the denouement, If you haven't heard that word, maybe I should write it down somewhere. Uh, do I know how to spell it? Let's see. Uh, de new. I'm trying to write with my trackpad here. It's a little bit slow. Mont. It's a French word. I don't know the literal meaning of it, but it means something like falling action as opposed to the rising action that leads to the climax, the denouement. I feel like I've spelled it wrong, but it's okay. That's the sort of resolution, where everything gets tied together, and we move towards the end of the story. Okay. We've got the theme. So now we get to some more, I guess you could say, abstract or sort of higher level aspects of the fictional work. The theme would be something like the main idea or meaning or moral of the story. Symbols are things in the story that stand for or evoke a deeper meaning. Those are usually tied together with the theme in some way. So symbols are like specific objects or characters or places or events within the story that point us to the deeper meaning or idea or theme or moral of the story. Tone is one of the harder ones to pin down. This is something like the attitude, feeling, and mood conveyed by the author. So it's sort of how the author is, um, you know, uh, it's their attitude towards the story and towards the characters in it. Yeah, the mood that they set, the sort of, you might even say the color, if that makes any sense. The tone. Yeah, that one's hard to pin down. I have to say I'm gonna have trouble identifying that one, I think. And then style, this is a little bit more concrete. This is sort of the writing style, the author's word choice, their sentence structure, and their individual voice. What makes, if you, for certain famous, fiction writers, if you can, tell that you're reading that author, even if you weren't, just from reading it and not from being told who it is, that would be because you're picking up on their distinctive style or voice. Okay, so I got some of these from this document here if you want to get some more details, but I hope this is pretty familiar stuff from previous English classes where you study literature. Okay, so we're not going to talk about every single one of these elements for every single story we read, but I'll try to do at least a few of them for each story, and we'll sort of focus on one of them in this lecture, and then we'll get to some other ones in the next one. Let me talk briefly about the author we're about to start reading, Abby Geni. So she is the author of The Last Animal, The Lightkeepers, The Wildlands, and The Body Farm. So if you see Body Farm in italics, that means the name of a book. That's a collection of short stories. The specific short story that we're reading called The Body Farm would be put in quotation marks. That's good stuff to know for when you're citing these texts, if you're, writing papers or just on your weekly updates or whatever assignments it may be. Book titles are usually in italics, and then like articles, short stories, and things like that would be in quotation marks. That's just a typical convention for citations. Anyway, and then of course we are reading the Body Farm story within a different collection, Best American Mystery and Suspense, BAMS. Okay, so at the end of that book, they give this little blurb about her. She's a faculty member at Story Studio Chicago and frequent visiting associate professor of fiction at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. Okay, and she has a little blurb that she writes about the process of writing The Body Farm, and this is what she says. This story was a collision. Some stories are organic things growing from one seed into a single theme. Others are delicately woven out of related threads. The Body Farm was made in the fiery crash of a dozen disconnected ideas. I was thinking about, let's see if there's actually a dozen of them. She was thinking about fairy tales, The Metamorphic Glory of Insects, The Cask of Amontillado. That's a famous short story by Edgar Allan Poe. Maybe we'll read that later this semester. The Limits, both logistical and logical, of law enforcement when it comes to stalking. A class I once took on child psychology. And Then There Were None. That's I guess, a book by Agatha Christie. Human Decomposition Research Laboratories and the scientists who choose to work there, and a few personal obsessions I won't name. Okay, so that's 8 things. And in theory, she says these things don't make much sense together, but sometimes writing happens that way. The impact of ideas, an alchemical reaction, and the fusion of a new story. So it's interesting. It was interesting to read this blurb after reading the story because the story feels very put together to me. It's pretty well structured. It doesn't seem like it's a collision of 8 different disconnected ideas. But it's interesting to hear her mention all these things. Most of these are pretty obviously related to the story. I actually don't know what the Agatha Christie book is about, so that would be something to look into. Um, but yeah, okay. So let's try to briefly go through all 11 elements and say something about each of them for this story. And then we'll go into detail with one of those elements. So we'll briefly identify each of the elements. And so this is a good exercise if you're, especially if you're writing your final paper on some of these short stories, it would probably be a good idea to go through and identify each of the elements. So here's a little example of that. So the point of view of the body farm. So it's narrated from the first person point of view of the nameless wife of Beatrice who works at the body farm and, spoiler alert, is the murderer in the story. She murders Emerson. Okay. So she's the narrator, so it's a first person narrator. She's not omniscient. She only knows her own thoughts and the events that she's part of. Um, so yeah, first person point of view. Although I should mention, it's also interestingly, I don't know, I didn't write this down, but it's also in the second person, which is very rare. Second person is when you are addressing somebody and you use the second person pronoun you or you all. And so she is talking to her, she's writing to her children. And so they are being addressed in the second person, and that's sort of a framing, device for the whole story, but it's also a first person point of view as well. Okay. The setting is the family's home in Lisle, Iowa, the nearby Anthropological Research Center, which is called the Body Farm as a nickname, and various places in Beatrice's past, Colorado, Maine, Texas, I think. The characters. We've got the nameless narrator. Let's call her N. Okay. And Beatrice are the protagonists, the main characters. Emerson is the antagonist, the person who has a conflict with the protagonists. And then there's a bunch of minor characters, including the children, the twin sons, Lucas and Theo, the narrator's co-workers at the body farm, and a few other random characters. Okay, but really there's the 3 main characters are N, Beatrice, and Emerson. The plot. Just to briefly describe the events, Emerson finds Beatrice after many years and begins stalking her again. The police are unable to help, so N murders Emerson and successfully covers it up at the body farm where she works. The exposition would include Beatrice's and Emerson's past, their relationship that ended a long time ago, but then he continued stalking her. So we get filled in on that in a sort of interesting way where Geni jumps sort of back and forth between like the current events of the story and the background past events. We get some exposition about their family life and the relationship of the 2 protagonists, and we get exposition about the body farm and how it works. The conflict, of course, is between the couple and Emerson. So Emerson refuses to leave Beatrice alone, quickly becomes an intolerable threat to Beatrice's and N's peace, and must be dealt with in one way or another. And the climax, of course, is the murder. Anne's murder of Emerson, or perhaps her decision to do it. Now that's interesting, and I guess I should point out, um, the stereotypical mystery story, murder mystery, let's say, is one where the murder usually happens at the beginning or has already happened before the story begins, and it's filled in as exposition. Um, but it usually happens early on, and then the investigation is what takes up most of the plot, and then the climax is when the killer is found, when the investigators figure out who done it. And so the typical who done it murder mystery tends to have that structure. This is, of course, not this story does not fit that at all. We know who the killer is from very early on, but she hasn't committed the murder until pretty late in the story, and that's the climax. And so we build up to the murder instead of building up to the solving of the crime by investigators. And of course, it's from the point of view of the killer, which is also not typical, although certainly it's been done before. I think I was looking up like who was the first one to do that. I think Agatha Christie, one of her, maybe that's the one. I'll have to put, let's see, what was it again? And then there were none. Maybe that's the one where it's from the point of view of the killer, which was, at the time Christie was writing, was something people hadn't really seen before. Although there's another famous novel, Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, is from the point of view of a murderer, but it's not, I guess, a mystery so much. But then again, is this story a mystery? That's something we should address. Maybe we'll address that at the end of the discussion of this story. To what extent does it count as a mystery when we know who the murderer is, and there's not really an investigation? So, of course, this collection of stories is called Mystery and Suspense. So maybe you could say, well, it's a suspense story. It's not a mystery story. Um, but I guess even though it's not the typical format of a murder mystery, it still raises some questions or mysteries about the ethics of vigilante justice and killing somebody, who is who deserves to be killed, perhaps, or do they? So there's sort of the mystery about whether what she does is the right thing. We'll get to that probably in the next lecture when I'll talk more about the ethical issues. But let me keep going with the elements here. So the last four are, as is often the case, trickier to identify. And let me make them come up one at a time. Okay. So I would say some of the themes would be the idea of fairy tale justice, or which we'll go into. Just the theme of death. The body farm is full of dead bodies. The theme of metamorphosis or transformation. And I would say toxic masculinity probably fits in here. There's a lot of stuff about uh, how she is, what her murder is she thinks about at least continuing to kill mostly men, it seems, who, either commit sexual assault or stalking or things like that. And so, yeah, there's some stuff about gender, uh, stereotypes um, and stuff like that. Okay, so we'll say more about the themes at some point, but these are just, it's hard to capture themes in just one word or one phrase. But I don't want to go into too much detail with these just now. Symbols. I thought some symbols in the story were insects, science as a symbol of the type of person the narrator is. The fact that she's a scientist relates to her character, and the fact that the way that she commits the murder and so on. We'll talk about that in a few, maybe starting on the next slide, actually. The children's book, which is also nameless, with the evil wizard, as well as N's own sketch of a fairy tale at the very end of the story. Those seem to be symbolic of the actual events of the story. The tone, again, I find it hard to describe tone. Here's what I came up with. I would say the tone is not too serious or dark, despite the subject matter. Usually, we think of mystery stories as having a kind of, darkness, seriousness. You think of like film noir as a similar genre that has that kind of gritty darkness to it. I don't really get that from this story. It has a kind of um, warmth and lightness to it in a way. So I say the world of the story is a lively place, from the color and excitement of the kids at home to the body farms, colonies of insects, and verdant vegetation flourishing on the decay. So I don't know, those elements sort of make it feel less, dry and dark and bloody, and it's more sort of vibrant, I want to say. Um, on the theme of fairy tale justice, the tone is sort of militantly and ruthlessly optimistic. There seems to be a message which I could put, so the theme of fairy tale justice seems to be the idea that if we can just get rid of evil people, then we can all live happily ever after, right? If you once you defeat the enemy in the fairy tale, then they all live happily after ever, which I think are the last words of the story. Okay, so that seems to be part of the tone as well, this sort of optimism. We'll talk more about optimism and pessimism when we look at the characters, which have different attributes in that sense. And finally, for the style, oh, here's where I mentioned the second person. So Jenny employs the rarely used second person by framing the story as a confession letter to the kids, although she says it's not a confession letter. We'll see what it is at some point. She makes use of flashbacks to stagger the exposition, which is a nice device. If you put all the exposition up front, that's pretty, forbidding and makes the story hard to get into if you have to read up on all this backstory before you actually get to the story. So she jumps back and does a little bit of backstory, a little bit of exposition, and then comes forward again and then jumps back again. There's some technical, science-y aspects to the story, which I guess is part of the style, and even some comedic moments sprinkled in. So, okay, that gives us a little overview, and now we will get into some more detail. And for this lecture, I'm going to focus in almost entirely on the characters. So I've chosen, I think this is a very character-driven story. So that's another thing you can do once you've identified all the elements, is you can try to figure out which ones are sort of the most important for the given work of fiction that you're reading and maybe writing about. So we can talk about a character-driven story, a plot-driven story, a conflict-driven story, a theme-driven story. Maybe some of the other ones could work as well. But you'll see, I didn't know that I was going to be focusing so much on the characters, but when I started creating these slides, I had realized I had quite a bit of things I wanted to say about the characters. And so that's all that I'm going to focus on in this lecture, although other elements of the story, of course, will come up as I start talking about the characters. So let's start with the narrator, the nameless narrator, protagonist and killer. Again, let's call her by the letter N because we don't know her name. The fact that we don't learn her name is surely intended, right? Usually a character in a story is going to be given a name. So it's uncommon to have a nameless character, and it's even more uncommon for that to be the protagonist and the narrator. So it's surely intended by Abby Jenny, and perhaps this signifies something about her character. Perhaps it signifies her solitary and private life, her frequent absence or distance from her family. And there's lots of snippets throughout the story where she sort of emphasizes her absence or her distance from her family. So here's some examples. She writes on page 136, "You did not know much about my work then." And remember, you is referring to the children. She's addressing them in the second person. "You knew Beatrice, mommy, stayed home with you, and you knew that I, mama, went to work and then came back again. What I did out there in the world away from you was inconsequential and vague. So she's kind of a mystery to her children. She goes to work she does like night shifts. She probably comes home and just sleeps like for a long time during the day. And her children don't know what her work is. It's vague. I guess Beatrice is the stay-at-home mom. So yeah, that's one aspect or one quotation about this aspect of the character. She writes when let's see, when is this? 142. This is yeah, when they're like when Emerson is starting to really get close and he's, giving notes and I guess when he's like maybe standing outside their house at one point, so when the action starts to build, the conflict starts to build. She goes into work even though Beatrice is distraught and she writes, "I did not feel right abandoning my family in this moment of crisis." But she does so anyway. Beatrice says, "Oh, I'll be fine," and she says, "Okay," and she goes to work. So yeah, the fact that she describes it as abandoning my family again seems to emphasize the fact that she is sort of, at a distance from them. She's frequently absent, and she's even absent in moments of crisis. And then she also just mentions that she has always maintained a distance in relationships. So again, her solitary and private lifestyle is coming through here. And this is all seemingly relevant to the fact that she ends up committing a murder, right? So we might wonder, is this nameless character, how much of a real person is she? Is she a heartless, ruthless killer, or does she have actual, human contact that would, despite the fact that she's often distant from her uh, family. So perhaps N's namelessness also suggests that she is to some extent out of touch with her humanity to some degree, at least, at an emotional level, perhaps bordering on psychopathy. So a psychopath being somebody who doesn't feel, you know, pro-social emotions, pro-social being the opposite of antisocial, emotions of, sympathy for other people, uh, you know, uh, genuine care and concern for others, genuine friendship. A psychopath, doesn't feel these emotions and hence is capable of acting in ways that the majority of us might not. I'm probably not getting the definition of psychopathy completely correct here, but hopefully you get the idea. So the fact that she carefully plans and carries out a premeditated murder without being seemingly in it doesn't phase her at all. So she's like the complete opposite of the main character of Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, who has a complete mental breakdown after committing a murder. Um, so he has, human emotions that are, haunting him. She seems very cool and collected throughout the entire story. She says of herself at one point, "I could focus on the trees instead of the forest," which indicates an analytical mindset that is capable of ignoring or abstracting from the bigger human picture. I think I mentioned this sort of saying in the previous lecture, "Don't miss the forest for the trees." And in that first lecture, I was focusing on the forest. I was talking big picture. I was trying to, give a philosophical introduction to the course. In the critical thinking lectures, we will be going and focusing on the trees. And so that's a more analytic thing to do, to look at the parts, to look at the details, to look at the components. And then there's sort of the synthetic uh, side of thinking. There's the analytical side and then the synthetic side. The synthetic side takes the parts and builds them up to the whole, and then looks at the whole again, looks at the forest again, and understands it better because one has already analyzed it and seen all of the trees. So the fact that she says she can focus on the trees instead of the forest seems to mean that she can sort of set certain things aside, like whatever emotions an average person might feel if they were planning and committing a murder. She just focuses on, what are the steps of the plan? Got to carry out the plan. She's focusing on the trees. Again, that seems to make her distant, not just literally distant from her family, but sort of emotionally distant from humanity, you might say, um, or from sort of normal society. Okay. So consider how she describes her cool, calculated attitude towards the murder. She writes, "Years at the body farm have reshaped my reaction to death. Emerson was a problem for me to solve. I killed Emerson because I had to. There was no other solution to the particular problem of his aliveness." Now, I think that's a really well, written w way of capturing this sort of almost robotic attitude that she has. The particular problem of his aliveness. It's so awkwardly phrased, but it works because that's what it's trying to capture is how awkward she is in the sense that this is not something that a normal person who has normal human emotions is going to think. They're not going to think that the fact that somebody is alive is a problem that needs to be solved by killing them. And so you really get this aspect of her character really comes through here. Let me do a little philosophical interlude while we're talking about this sort of stuff. So I would say that N exhibits a high degree of what philosophers call instrumental rationality. What does that mean? Well, something is instrumental if it's like a means to an end, if it's an instrument or a tool that you use to do something else. Instrumental rationality, therefore, is the use of reason to help one achieve one's goals, whether those goals come from reason or from our sensuous desires or from somewhere else, our emotions perhaps, or maybe there's other parts to us. And whether or not those goals and the actions of achieving those goals are morally good, morally neutral, or morally evil. In other words, instrumental rationality is just reason is solving a problem. It's figuring out how to do something, but the thing that we're doing might be something that reason isn't uh, setting as its own goal, but our sort of sensible, uh, you know, um, aspect, our non-rational, the non-rational part of us is where the desire for that goal comes from in the first place, and then reason basically serves those sensuous desires by helping them figure out how to achieve what they want with no consideration of the morality of what those desires are desires for. So, a simple model of instrumental rationality that philosophers often use is what's called the belief desire model. We've got some beliefs about what's true, about facts, about how the world is and how it works. We've got beliefs, and then we've got desires, things that we want, things that we are striving for, things that we're pursuing, things that we think ought to exist, or things that we value. When we value something's existence, we desire to bring it about or create it or achieve it or possess it. So we've got beliefs about how things are. We've got desires about what we want and what should be ours, according to us. And from those, we infer which actions we ought to perform in order to achieve those desires, and based on our beliefs about the facts that are going to be relevant to achieving our desires. Okay, so just to give a super simple example, um, I believe that my favorite food is in the fridge. I desire my favorite food right now. Therefore, I should open the fridge and get it. Okay? I've got a belief that there's something in there. I have a desire to eat that thing. And those two th together, my belief and my desire, to lead me to act in a way that fulfills the desire. Okay? So that's a very simple idea of how we can use reason to get what we want in the world. Okay? And it is N's instrumental rationality that seems to be part of what allows her to get away with murder, literally. She comments at one point, the police are fond of saying there's no such thing as a perfect murder, but I don't agree. There are flaws in any system. I helped design this particular system, so I'm aware of its flaws. So the fact that she can plan out this murder and get away with it, again, is a use of instrumental rationality. She wants to commit the murder, regardless of whether it's right or wrong. We'll get to that ethical question later. She is able to reason very well about what she needs to do, how she needs to do it, and getting everything lined up and only acting when the time is right. All of that is her using instrumental rationality to achieve her end of getting rid of Emerson, of solving the problem of his aliveness. Okay. Um, just to have again a sort of philosoph this is a little philosophical interlude, so I'll mention one famous philosopher, David Hume from the 1700s. He is well known for arguing that human reason consists entirely of instrumental rationality. I'm going to mention a different kind of reason or rationality on the next slide, but Hume thought that reason is nothing more than what I've just described. And his famous claim that this is the case is as follows. He writes, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and reason can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. So the passions, we could say, are what I was calling sensuous desires up here, or perhaps emotionally based desires. Um, they are either non-rational or irrational parts of us. And he's saying that the rational part of us, our power of reason, should is and should remain the slave or the servant or the tool, the instrument of the passions, of our non-rational desires. He thinks that there's nothing reason can do. Reason can't come up with desires of its own, he says. Reason can't actually motivate us to do things unless we already have a passion for them or a sensuous desire for them. The only thing reason can do is have beliefs about the way the world is, and then reason is what performs the inference, uh, which leads us to act in such a way that will fulfill our desires based on our beliefs about how things work. We'll talk a lot about inference in the critical thinking component of this course. Inference is really another word for reasoning. Okay. So Hume was all about instrumental rationality, and he thought that's all there is to reason. However, I would say that our narrator N also appears to have a capacity for moral reason. What do I mean by that? Well, according to one way of thinking, moral reason is the use of reason to determine how one ought to act in a given situation, no matter who one happens to be, and no matter what beliefs and desires one happens to have. Now, that might not be what you expected when I said I was going to talk about morality here. Why is that morality? Well, this way of thinking about morality comes from the philosopher Kant, who I discussed quite a bit in the previous lecture. I was focusing mostly on Kant's theoretical philosophy from the Critique of Pure Reason. I briefly mentioned the Critique of Practical Reason, which is a work of mostly his moral philosophy and his philosophy of human agency and free will. Um, And but probably his most famous work of moral philosophy is called The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. We may go into some of the details of his theory of morality later in the course, but he's where this way of thinking of moral reason up here is me giving you a version of Kant. Okay, so he thinks that, let me just try to give a little bit more to this. Basically, he distinguishes between what he calls hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. An imperative is like a command or something. When you tell somebody to do something, you're speaking in the imperative mood or mode. Um, a hypothetical imperative is when you say something like this: if you want to make a lot of money, you've got to learn how to play the game. Imagine if somebody said that to you as some kind of like business advice or something, right? You got to learn how to play the game, whatever that means, right? If you want to make a lot of money. This is a hypothetical imperative because it starts with an if. Okay, so hypothetically, if you want to make a lot of money, if that's true that you do, then you ought to learn how to play the game. And so there's an ought claim, that's the imperative or the command, you should learn how to play the game or just learn how to play the game. But it's only you only have to follow that command if you want to make a lot of money. And so you can, for any hypothetical imperative, you can opt out of it. You can say, you know what? I don't really care about making a lot of money. So, screw your game, business dude. Okay. Um, so that kind of imperative, hypothetical imperative, relates to instrumental reason. Instrumental reason, again, says, given things that you already desire, here's what you ought to do to satisfy those desires. As you can see, the hypothetical imperative I gave, if you have is of that form. If you have a desire for money, then you ought to perform certain actions that are called playing the game, right? But the other kind of imperative that Kant talks about, a categorical imperative, means that it's not hypothetical. It's an ought claim. It's telling you what you should do, what you ought to do, but there's no if. There's no part of the sentence that says, if you desire this or that, then you ought to act in this way. A moral imperative is a categorical imperative in the sense that it just tells us what we ought to do, regardless of what desires we happen to have. And there's no way to opt out of morality in the way we can opt out of hypothetical imperatives by saying, "Oh, I don't actually desire that the money, so I don't need to play the game." Morality isn't like that. Morality doesn't say like, "Well, if you want to be nice to people, then you should." Morality, a moral command says something like, "You should be nice to people." Period, right? Not only not if you want to, it's just something you should do, regardless of whether you want to or not, right? Regardless of whether you have a sensuous desire for it. If some people just naturally enjoy helping people. It makes them feel good. Other people might not get that. Some people might be psychopaths, but a psychopath can still have moral reason, even if they don't feel a natural desire to help people. If they can convince themselves that it's the right thing to do, they might be able to act on that, even though they don't have any feeling behind it. It's just purely based on reason. And that's what Kant thinks morality is. He thinks it's purely based on reason. So that whether or not you're a psychopath, everybody can be morally good if we act in the way we ought to. And then, of course, everybody wants to know, well, how ought we to act? Does he have specific commands or moral laws? Yes, he does, but I'm not going to go into the details of that right now. Okay. Anyway, why do I bring this up? Well, because the narrator is clearly thinking about things in moral terms. Okay? She's not the kind of killer who is totally immoral or amoral and just, hates somebody so much that they just can't resist killing them. Okay? She sees what she's doing as vigilantism. In other words, a It's a part of what she thinks of as a necessary fight for justice outside the law. Killing Emerson was not simply something she desired. She didn't have like a bloodlust and she wanted to, see him, see him die out of some sort of, for some physical gratification or anything like that. It wasn't something she simply desired. Rather, she thought it was the right thing to do. She did it because she thought it was the right thing to do. She was acting out of moral reason. She was thinking, I ought to do this regardless of whether I desire to do it, regardless of whether I fear the consequences. It needs to be done. He is a problem that needs to be solved. Okay. So here's another passage about that. She says, I sleep well at night, knowing that I'm helping to balance the scales of justice. So she's not like a murderer of the Raskolnikov type from Crime and Punishment, where he cannot sleep well at night. He's totally, you know, in a state of turmoil and inner, sort of he's self-destructing after he commits this murder, basically. She is the opposite. She is at peace with it. She thinks she's done the right thing. What happened to Emerson, she says, was not legal, but it was right. It was fairy tale justice. That's one of the themes, remember? Bravely, cleverly, the knight slew the ogre and burned him up. So that's how she sees what she's doing. So just like in any fairy tale, if the knight is slaying the ogre, we're cheering it on. We don't say, "Ooh, the knight is a murderer. How could we support that?" No, they're killing the bad guy, right? It's okay. It's a good thing. It's fairy tale justice. Okay? That's how she sees herself. Um, just to make one other comment about this vigilante justice, it's based on the idea that what is moral and what is legal do not always coincide. There's a famous quote from Martin Luther King Jr. From letter from Birmingham City Jail, where he wrote that one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws, right? Legally, we have a responsibility, or we're supposed to obey all laws. But what's moral and what is legal can come apart in both ways. What do I mean by that? Something can be immoral but legal, and something can be illegal but moral. Killing Emerson was, according to the narrator, morally right but illegal. What would be a situation of something that is legal but morally wrong? I don't know, beating your children or something like that, right? We might think we should have a law that's, that should be illegal. I think it is illegal in some places, but not in others, and plenty of other things that we think maybe should be illegal but aren't. Those are things that we think of as immoral, but they are, in fact, legal in some places, right? Or to take a big example, slavery was legal for long periods of human history, and probably in some places it still is. In most places, it's now illegal, and because when it was legal, abolitionists realized it's immoral. We should abolish the law that says, or we should abolish slavery by making it illegal, right? Okay. So what is moral and what is legal do not always coincide, although there's you might say that an idea, a kind of ideal is to work towards a legal system where it coincides with morality as much as possible. Okay. Well, that's a whole nother story. All right, so philosophical interlude is over, and my initial discussion of the main character, the narrator, is over. Let me turn now to Beatrice. She's definitely the second most important character in the story. She's the narrator's wife, she's the mother of the twins, and she's the victim of Emerson's stalking. The narrator is clearly deeply in love with Beatrice. They're married, but they don't have they seem to have a good relationship still. However long they've been married, despite their differences, despite Beatrice's history. The narrator is deeply in love with Beatrice, and it seems like that's mutual. The narrator kills to defend her, after all, and she portrays Beatrice in an almost devotional manner. She is um, Beatrice's number one fan, other than Emerson, I guess. So this is perhaps best expressed in the following passage. She writes, God, I was smitten. I still am, honestly, all these years later. Oh, something I was going to look up. I wonder if this is the only mention of God in the story. I think it might be when she's describing Beatrice. That seems significant to me. But anyway, I might come back to that later. Um, your mother is a rare creature. The way she listens with her whole body, the way she radiates calm in a palpable force field, softening the mood of an entire room, the way she reacts viscerally and audibly to whatever she's reading. Her hopefulness is like a kite rising on the wind, carried irresistibly upward. As a grouchy pessimist, I stand in awe of her innate buoyancy. That's a great sort of metaphor, the idea that she's buoyant, she floats, she's not pulled down, she just somehow rises up. Okay. Nothing else could have seen through Emerson's madness. Each time she escaped him, she was able to hope sincerely and completely that it would end. Okay, so there's a few things going on here. She's describing Beatrice's optimism, but she's also just describing how good of a person she thinks Beatrice is and how much she loves her because of that. So the portrayal of Beatrice throughout the story is quite rich and detailed, especially for a short story where there's not a whole lot of time always to go into a lot of detail with the characters. I would say most short stories are tend to be more plot driven. This one seems more character driven to me, though. And so that's why I'm spending so much time with the characters. So the portrayal of Beatrice is rich and detailed, highlighting her warm personality, her various charming qualities, her history with Emerson, and more. Consider how she describes Beatrice's free-spirited younger self. Beatrice never loved him. She was young. This is one of the first flashbacks where she's talking about when they first met, I think, as teenagers, Beatrice and Emerson. Beatrice was young, sowing her wild oats and reveling in being out of her parents' house. So that freedom to just live in a way that one chooses for oneself, to not be restricted by one's parents, to sort of go into young adulthood or I guess adulthood, um, and to travel around and see the world and find oneself and all that, right? Beatrice stayed in Colorado for 2 years. She was content there, working at a coffee shop and daydreaming idly about getting an MFA in visual art or theater. She liked the clear mountain air, the hiking trails, and the breathtaking vista outside her living room window. So she's, a creative type. She's, content and happy enough, at least, with a probably not a very well-paying job, but she seems to be pursuing her dream, her passions. She's in a, you know, healthy environment, despite Emerson. Other details about Beatrice. We get her peculiar sleeping position, which is one of the first things we learn about her, that she sleeps on her stomach with her knees bent, and so her lower legs up in the air. I can't figure out if that's a symbol for anything. It gets mentioned twice in the story, and I don't know what it's supposed to mean, other than it makes Beatrice just charming and idiosyncratic. We learn that she's bisexual, of course. She's in a lesbian marriage, but she's had boyfriends in the past, including Emerson. And then we get the narrator's comparison of Beatrice to the golden-hearted woman, which is the sort of princess type character in the fairy tale that they read to the children, which again, that story doesn't have a name. I guess, I don't know, maybe the cover fell off at some point, so they're not sure what the book is called, but it's like their children's favorite story. I might get to that in the next lecture when I talk about symbols. So those are some features of Beatrice. And one last thing, well, maybe not one last thing. I think I have a whole nother slide on her, but Beatrice's name might be, I'm not sure if it is, but it might be an allusion to the Beatrice of Dante's Paradiso, the third part of the Divine Comedy, where Dante goes to heaven after being in hell and purgatory. He's accompanied by the poet Virgil, who's sort of his hero throughout the first two parts, Inferno and Purgatory, and then Virgil can't go to heaven because he's a pagan from ancient Rome. So Beatrice, Dante's lover who died young, I believe, is there waiting for him in heaven and guides him through the different sort of spheres of the heavenly realm. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the contrast between the narrator and Beatrice. So Beatrice is generally portrayed in this highly positive light, but Anne also sees Beatrice's optimism as somewhat naive. After all, she keeps talking about how Beatrice continues to hope that Emerson will leave her alone, even though all signs point to him just persisting with his stalking, no matter what Beatrice says to him or however much she moves, he keeps following her. It doesn't seem like he's going to go away, and that's part of why he's a problem that needs to be solved. So, as opposed to Beatrice's optimism, the narrator is more of a realist. She does call herself a pessimist, a grouchy pessimist in that earlier quotation I gave, but I would say that it's not clear this really fits with her moral conviction. Uh, Again, the fact that and actually, I'm about to tell you what I mean by that. Um, she realizes that she needs to take action in order to make things happen because Emerson won't stop and the police won't stop him either. And so she makes this clear in what she says to her kids about their future. This is towards the end of the story. After she's killed Emerson, she says, "You, her children, will be good men." That isn't hopefulness on my part. It's not a naive optimism, but rather decision, intention. Despite our years together, none of Beatrice's optimism has rubbed off on me. I know you'll be good men because I will see to it. Lucas, with your tender heart, so like your mother's. Theo, with your righteous spirit, so much like mine. So there's a really interesting contrast here between, on the one hand, the optimism of Beatrice and the more pessimistic or realistic attitude of the narrator. And then I like these words here, the tender heart versus the righteous spirit. And she's not really making a value judgment and saying that one is better than the other. So she apparently sees that both ways of thinking have their value, and she really emphasizes this when after she's killed Emerson, and it's been a while, and she sort of is talking to Beatrice at one point and says, maybe he's finally moved on. Of course, she knows that he's dead, but Beatrice doesn't. Beatrice smiles at her, and then the narrator says, "Her hopefulness is amazing. I will never stop admiring it." And that seems genuine. It's a little bit patronizing. It's almost like, "Oh, you little naive, you sweet summer child," or whatever, right? But I think she genuinely admires it. And if the fact that she thinks Lucas's tender heart um, is sort of one of his positive, you might say, moral virtues. And then Theo's righteous spirit is also a moral virtue, but there are different kinds. Tender heart emphasizes a more emotion-based sense of morality, whereas a righteous spirit maybe is a more reason-based sense of morality. Maybe we need both of those. And that's actually a big criticism of Kant's moral theory, is that he's too much of a rationalist, that he thinks everything can be derived from reason. And so that doesn't seem to leave enough room for emotions like love, generosity, compassion, empathy, and so on. I think Kant does have those aspects to his moral theory, but they're definitely less emphasized, and so it's understandable that people object to him in that way. Okay, well, let me finish with a little bit on the third main character, which is, of course, Emerson, the villain, but also the murder victim, not the killer. So that's again an interesting twist here. Um, Unlike Anne and Beatrice, I would say, and this is my like a slight criticism, I really like the story, but I would say that Emerson is portrayed somewhat one-dimensionally. We don't really know anything about him other than the fact that he's stalking Beatrice. He seems to be little more than a typical creepy dude who refuses to take no for an answer, emotionally manipulates his victim and the police for that matter. He doesn't seem to understand that he's not wanted, or he's sort of self-deceiving. He's deceiving himself into thinking that he is, that Beatrice does want him, and he takes things way too far. This is shown well when Beatrice calls the cops on him when she's living in Colorado. So we get this passage. Emerson tried to push past her into the house. He just arrives at her house with like suitcases and like after they've been, broken up for a while. He told her he was sick of doing long distance and it was time for them to try living together. He was acting as though they'd never broken up, as though the events of the past 2 years had slipped his mind. She could not tell if it was a performance or if he really believed they were still together. If he could establish his version of events, his own version of events, with enough confidence right off the bat, and this is referring to when the police arrived, anything that Beatrice said to contradict him would seem dubious to the audience, in other words, the cops. And then he manipulates the police, as I mentioned here. The cops obviously felt such sympathy for this poor jilted Romeo that they broke procedure to give him a ride, and they were, sort of listening to him and believing what he was saying about him still being in a relationship with Beatrice, even though she's saying, "Please get this guy out of here." It took her, like, she really had to put her foot down for them to finally do their job, and they still gave him a ride. And then 2 weeks later, Beatrice moved to Maine. So she was forced to move again. The cops did nothing. And this sets us up for the rising action and the climax, which we'll get to next time. And we'll get more into the ethical dimension, um, and and then the themes and symbols as well. And so I'll, yeah, wrap up the story in the next lecture. All right. You will see me then. Bye bye.